Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2021 L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs Symposium, The Triple Pandemic, Implications for Racial Equity and Public Policy. I'm Susan Gooden, Dean of the Wilder School, and I'm pleased that you are joining us for today's vibrant discussion. Our annual Fall Symposium is the vision of our school's namesake, Governor Wilder, the 66th governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and a lifelong public servant who you will hear from momentarily. Some of the most recent symposia Governor Wilder has spearheaded for the school include our 2018 Symposium on the role of urban communities in improving housing, education, and public policy, and in 2019, the Race in America Symposium. And of course, last year in 2020, we virtually celebrated the 30th anniversary of the governor's historic election with a symposium that we co-hosted with our partners at Virginia Union University. Today's symposium topic and discussion is based on an upcoming excited book volume that we're very excited about, The Triple Pandemic, Implications for Racial Equity and Public Policy, which is being edited by myself, as well as Drs. Elsie Harper Anderson and Jay Albanese, who will join me today in moderating our panels. The Triple Pandemic references three specific areas: health, economics, and justice. The book will not simply document the existing problems made worse by the pandemic, but it also provides historical context to the issues that manifested in new ways, the existing inequities revealed during COVID-19. The volume is distinguished in its focus on the implications for racial equity through an examination of both existing public policy, as well as, of course, new ideas for change. The idea for this book emerged as a specific item in our broader Wilder School's Racial Equity Action Plan, or REAP, that we developed last year. We have assembled more than 25 scholars, most of whom are Wilder School faculty, for this volume. The volume will include 12 chapters, and we're honored that this volume will also include a foreword by Governor Wilder. This afternoon's symposium is organized around each of these three areas that I mentioned: health, economics, and justice. It offers a public kickoff and glimpse of the ideas proposed within the book. Our book proposal is currently under review by Routledge, and we're excited about potential next steps with them. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our school's namesake, Governor L. Douglas Wilder. Governor Wilder's career in public service includes brave service in the Korean War, where he earned a Bronze Star. He was first elected to office in 1969 when he became a state senator and went on to set several historic milestones, many of which you're all aware, including his 1990 election as the first elected African-American governor in the United States. As the Commonwealth's 66th governor, he was commended for his sound fiscal management and for balancing the state budget during very difficult economic times. Financial World magazine ranked Virginia as the best managed state in the United States for 2 consecutive years during his administration. You may recall that Governor Wilder also established Virginia's Rainy Day Fund. And at that time, it has recently been lauded by the Virginian Pilot and Daily Press editorial boards as recently as last weekend. Governor Wilder has celebrated many important milestones recently, including his 90th birthday and his 25th anniversary with Virginia Commonwealth University. We are so proud that he continues to serve as a distinguished professor at the school that bears his name. Governor Wilder.
I want to thank you for all that you've done for the school, what you do for the students, what you do for the community. See, the messages that we send, the whole reason and main reason that I came to Virginia Commonwealth University in the very first instance, some few years ago, to a school of government and public affairs was because I thought I might have known a little bit about it. And I wanted to be associated with a school that was dedicated to letting the people know, letting the public know, to educate, and for us to be further educated in that process. Because you learn from the people. You learn what their issues are. You learn what affects them. You learn what your role is as a leader to do those kinds of things. And not to be saying and doing things that sound good and make sound bites, but to do things that are meaningful. Dean, you and I likewise participated in Michigan State, to the University of Michigan, to talk about the celebration of the Kernel Commission report. Now, people might not even know what that report was about. 1968 was the year in which it was put forth because of the riots that had emanated as a result of the assassination of Martin Luther King and other kinds of things that took place. And yet, what was the conclusion of that report? That our nation is leading into two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. That was 50 years ago. My good friend Ken Clark, who was the psychologist who testified in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, said, yes, I will give my summation as to what is necessary and what is required as a result of this report. And however, I gave a summation and a surmise as it related to the riots in Harlem and other kinds of things that were unrest in the nation. And then he surmised and concluded there is required a national commitment on behalf of the nation to make what the reality of one nation under God indivisible. And yet, in this instance, we still find we have to go forth and speak. The acknowledgement that there's a need to recognize, identify, and remedy cause and effect has long been avoided. Why has that been and continues to be unresolved or even discussed? What sustainable arguments can be advocated for this avoidance, or justified rather? How can government correct and improve upon those things when those who are charged with those responsibilities continually avoid them? And so the onus for a participatory democracy or a republic rest on the understanding of the issues. That's why I continually say that people are always ahead of the leaders because they are there, they feel it. And I like the fact that you phrased the symposium subject as the triple what? Pandemic, because it is something that's going to affect us, that does affect us on a regular basis. And it's not going to be handed down from one generation to the other if we are to survive. The time now is to deal with it and to deal with it in realistic manner and to discuss it. We're very fortunate, and I hope that the essence of this gathering of scholars will produce further analysis and debate. The expertise that we have assembled here has been exhibited and recognized at national and international levels. And what they will be presenting will be further grist for the mill for intelligent debate and discussion. But the first acknowledgement, there's a need to recognize as to remedy this dread disease that's affecting us, that will continue to affect future generations unless we have the courage to identify the cause and to affect it. Good to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Governor Wilder. And I like what you said about referencing it back to the Kerner Commission and this note, the need for a national commitment. And hopefully today in the conversations that transpire, we can be a part of that and a part of that genesis to begin that national commitment that needs to occur. And we are also deeply grateful that you chose our book volume as the focus of your symposium this year. At this time, we are honored to hear from VCU President Michael Rao. Dr. Rao became the 5th president of VCU and the VCU Health System in 2009. Under President Rao's leadership, VCU's place among national research universities has continued to rise. U.S. News and World Report ranks 22 graduate programs, including the Wilder School, among top programs. President Rao.
Good afternoon and welcome to Virginia Commonwealth University. Thank you for joining us. The L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs choice of topics for this year's Wilder Symposium is very timely, as the COVID-19 pandemic introduced to a largely unaware public the devastating impact of disparities on the well-being of communities of color. As president of VCU and the VCU Health System, I'm very grateful to partner with colleagues dedicated to addressing and reducing health and economic disparities that are experienced by many communities of color living right here in the city and throughout the region. We've got to be unrelenting in our work to ensure access and opportunity to all human beings. Governor Wilder is a distinguished professor and trailblazer. Today's Wilder Symposium is an opportunity to tackle systems and policies that perpetuate inequality at the expense of the well-being of communities of color. Thank you for your willingness to engage in critical discussions with divergent and informed perspectives, like the ones that you'll explore today. Listen, engage, and leverage the expertise of the scholars that you'll hear from today, and familiarize yourself with resources like the Wilder School's Research Institute for Social Equity, also known as RISE. Through the thoughtful, impactful, multidisciplinary scholarship, research, training, and engagement, RISE works to advance social justice and inform public policy, specifically for marginalized voices within our society. You'll learn more about the important contributions of RISE in the first panel that will be moderated by Dean Gooden. Thank you again for participating in today's symposium. You're part of a larger collective that will build more inclusive public policy. I'm grateful to all of you for your dedication to all of humanity.
Thank you so much to President Rao. As President Rao noted, much of our work on racial equity is occurring in the Wilder School's Research Institute for Social Equity, or RISE. So to get us started today, we've asked Dr. Robin McDougall, who is our Associate Dean of Research and Outreach, as well as an Associate Professor in the Wilder School, to share with us some of the poll work recently completed by RISE. You will see that these poll results have been a highly valuable information resource to policymakers about the triple pandemic. Dr. McDougall.
Thank you so much, Dean Gooden. As Dean Gooden mentioned, I will be able to set the stage today for today's symposium by highlighting some of the findings that citizens of the Commonwealth have regarding the triple pandemic. The Commonwealth Poll, which has been conducted in the Wilder School for nearly 30 years, truly does serve as that bellwether for policymakers in Virginia and beyond. And we're honored to have Governor Wilder serve as both the voice and the guiding hand of the Commonwealth Poll. In 2020, we were honored to be selected as a CNN presidential poll as well. Next slide, please. In the first phase of our pandemic today, we're looking at the healthcare perspective. This past summer, in a partnership with the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, we conducted several statewide polls looking at vaccine use and vaccine hesitancy across the Commonwealth. You will notice in both the blue blue and red lines, blue being Black Virginians and red being Hispanic Virginians, that it wasn't until almost May that either, specifically the Hispanic Virginians, reached the level of white Virginians in vaccine usage, the white Virginians being in the purple line. It took all the way until July before African American Virginians reached vaccine usage of white Virginians. And at that same time, we started to see a reduction in vaccine usage in Hispanic Virginians. This is an important slide to look at this healthcare perspective in the triple pandemic and the disproportionate minority impact we're seeing in Virginia with both vaccine usage and vaccine hesitancy across the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. The second aspect of the triple pandemic, the economic impacts of COVID, once again shows the disproportionate impact in our African American and Hispanic communities in Virginia. In looking at our polling results from June of 2021, we once again see that African Americans and Hispanics fall behind in paying their rent or mortgage, paying their credit card bills and other household bills, as well as having trouble paying for food in comparison to white Virginians. When you look at specifically credit card and other household bills, you will see that African Americans are almost 4 times less likely or having more difficulty in paying those bills than white Virginians. Next slide, please. The third aspect of the triple pandemic, as noted by Governor Wilder and Dean Gooden, is the justice perspective. In January of 2021, we conducted a Commonwealth poll across the Commonwealth to examine the extent in which Virginians felt the policies passed by the Virginia General Assembly and their special session in the summer of 2020 aimed at truly adequately confronting systemic racism in Virginia, specifically around bills associated with civilian review boards for law enforcement and preventing activities such as chokeholds. You will notice that minorities were more supportive of these measures than whites were at 21% to 11%, in comparison to whites were less supportive of these bills in comparison to minorities, 21%. Supporting that they were not effective in comparison to 12% of minorities. But it's really important to note here that even for minorities that felt that the General Assembly's bills that were passed in the summer of 2020, only 21% thought they were adequately addressed systemic racism in Virginia. So it shows that there is still a significant amount of work to be done in Virginia and during the General Assembly with regard to the third aspect of the triple pandemic, justice reform. Next slide, please. Thank you all very much. In the chat, you will find a link to the entire Commonwealth polls as detailed in today's presentation. And I look forward to the rest of the symposium.
Thank you so much, Dr. McDougall. It was great to provide a quick overview of the divergent opinions along each of the topic areas that we're going to focus on today: health, justice, and economics. So in the next sessions that proceed, each topic will be about 20 minutes in length, and we will include a moderator and a discussion by a few of the authors in that section of the book. So we know we can't completely replicate the armchair format that is so characteristic of our in-person Wilder Symposium, but we know that the conversations that ensue here virtually will offer rich discussion of issues that are both critical and contemporary. So I will kick it off by moderating our first session on health, and I'll ask the panelists that are joining me to join me on screen. On the screen, you will see the complete listing of chapters and authors for this section, but in the interest of time, we will be joined by 3 of the chapter authors. This includes Dr. Nakina Douglas-Glenn, who is Interim Director of the Research Institute for Social Equity and also serves as Director of the Gracie Harris Leadership Institute. Dr. Hans Louis Charles, who is an Assistant Professor in our Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness Program. And Dr. Jackie Smith Mason, who is our Senior Associate Dean in the VCU Honors College. So welcome, Drs. Douglas-Glenn, Dr. Louis Charles, and Dr. Smith Mason. I'd like to start this session with Nakina, if I can. So Nakina, I know that the chapter that you and your co-authors are working on is looking at advancing racial equity relative to vaccinations in Virginia, and that much of this work was informed by key partnerships between government and university researchers, including like the governor's office and the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. Can you help us understand more about this work and how it was helpful to overall vaccination efforts?
Great, thank you, Susan. So our partnership was with the Virginia Equity Leadership Task Force, which was a part of the Commonwealth's Unified Emergency Support Team. As you know, this team included a number of state agencies in addition to private and nonprofit organizations. So we were able to bolster the state's efforts from the very beginning to address its vaccination allocation strategy. And specifically, we were asked to join the team to focus on equitable distributions of the vaccine to communities of color, vulnerable populations, traditionally marginalized individuals, and communities that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. So this included both cases and fatalities, as well as economic loss, among other areas. And as you may recall, numerous national reports indicated that inequities in the planned vaccination allocation and distribution strategies across the country existed. And we knew that these approaches would likely result in communities of color being underrepresented in the number of people vaccinated. So with most states very early on focusing their vaccine strategy on age, we understood that we should be planning a different approach, one that was designed to reach those communities typically underserved. Given what we knew about life expectancy, comorbidities impacting communities of color, and structural racism, we recognized that prioritizing people of color was necessary. And that it was also not likely to occur. Early numbers indicated that if no one was focused on equity, we would have major differences in vaccination rates. Very early on, Virginia was well positioned to address issues of equity, having the only state-level office for diversity, equity, and inclusion as another central organizing structure. And it meant that there was accountability with someone who was responsible for the success of equity-driven strategy. You also had agencies like the Department of Emergency Management, the Department of Health, that were already moving in the direction of equity-informed practice before the onset of COVID. And then lastly, there was us, the Wilder School, known for its commitment to producing equity-relevant scholarship in public spaces. So together we saw a void in the attention being given to racial equity as the key factor for influencing the onset and diagnosis of COVID. So we saw this as a major undertaking. We took our charge to develop a number of strategies to advance equity and vaccination distribution. These strategies included for us state comparisons of best practices, targeted community vaccination plans, detailed guides for the on-the-ground work for community navigators, monthly equity status reports, statewide representative polls that Dr. McDougall talked about earlier, interviews and focus groups focused on vaccination hesitancy and access, general equity and research guidance. So our university team provided a research foundation for the work of the task force charged with the responsibility and oversight of addressing COVID. So this partnership was necessary. While the task force focused on their designated strategy, we could really target our attention on diving deep into understanding the outreach efforts from a practical standpoint with an applied research focus. The partnership provided the state with subject matter experts on equity for a policy and action research perspective. It also provided a model for interagency collaboration that could inform future policy development, implementation, and evaluation. And it also demonstrates that you can prioritize equity as a legitimate tool for driving public policy decisions. We were able to help guide the administration's initiatives to meet the goal of vaccination equity throughout the Commonwealth. And we did this through bringing together a pooled group of scholars with varied expertise, leveraging personal community relationships to support and inform our approaches, being on call for the task force to address equity issues as they were presented across the state, and utilizing an iterative learning process and revising plans and approaches to best meet community needs. So from the very beginning of our work with the Health Equity Task Force, we centered equity as an essential organizing strategy around which to have all the conversations with stakeholders. So there are a number of strengths and weaknesses, things that worked well for us that we can talk about during the course of our conversation this afternoon. One that I want to highlight is really that we had a research team with long-term experience in applying racial equity framework to the development, implementation, and evaluation of policies and programs for public and nonprofit entities. From a state perspective, there was a willingness to be receptive to the input from the team as subject matter experts on matters of racial equity. I think you also have to have trust. So there was a high degree of trust between the state agencies and our university academic team that really helped to guide and validate decision-making. And then our data could also be utilized for immediate turnaround for public messaging and targeted efforts. Some of the challenges when we talk about partnerships is really timing. You know, the COVID environment was rapidly changing environment. So we had to be agile in our approach to work and also to change our plans to best meet the needs of the task force. We also experienced perhaps some resistance in the system. You know, there's often a get it done mindset when we have things that we really need to do from an emergency perspective. So we wanted to infuse a let's get it done, but also focusing on equity. So we believe that the state could best reach its goal even with an equity strategy. And even though COVID was a unique experience we were entering into, there were partnerships with agencies that had existing protocols and procedures in place that dictated their workflow and operations. And so it provided us an opportunity to address components that were often out of bounds for agencies, but that we could much easily do as academic institutions. And so it was really a great partnership. We look forward to talking more about it in our chapter and more about it in this afternoon's conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Douglas Glenn, and you certainly highlighted several things that I'd like to follow up on. But why don't we hear from the other two panelists, and then we can open it up for discussion. And also, although we won't be taking questions directly from the audience, please feel free in the chat feature to have comments and to continue the conversation because this is a community-based conversation. Let me now bring Hans into the conversation. You know, Hans, when I think about emergency management, and it's certainly not my field, but when I think about it, prior to COVID, emergency management was generally viewed as a time-specific event. So for example, maybe there's a hurricane and then there's a cleanup, and so you got the phases. But given the length and the magnitude of COVID, how is racial equity important in emergency management in perhaps different ways?
Thank you, Susan. Well, racial equity is extremely important, but unfortunately, it continues to be mostly, if not completely, ignored in emergency management. So despite decades of research that has shown time and time again that disasters of all sorts have a disproportionate impact on African Americans and other minority communities, there is no racial equity is not a core tenet of emergency management at all. COVID-19's impact is just the latest iteration of this disproportionate impact on these communities that we have seen time and time again. And in fact, the predictability of this disproportionate impact of disasters on racial and ethnic minorities with the intersection of poverty, in fact, has been a catalyst for policies away from equity and towards an approach of limited intervention and personal responsibility. This can be traced back to 1965, Hurricane Betsy. The impact on African-American communities in New Orleans was a catalyst for us moving towards SBA loans instead of grants when it comes to recovery. And this is a policy that continues today. The available limited public assistance is really predicated on state leadership, but most importantly on the capabilities of the local government and their emergency management apparatus. So disasters occur at the local level. So the response, the preparedness, and the recovery also occurs at the local level. And in fact, the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 stipulates that local governments must conduct a hazard mitigation plan in order to receive federal funding. Hence the vital importance of the local government and the focus of our chapter. So my co-authors and I wanted to see how this latest iteration of what we're finding with COVID-19, how has this, encouraged, let's say, emergency management at the local level to include or incorporate racial equity into their planning. So what we found was both alarming, but not surprising. So we looked at the 10 most impacted states with the highest death rates from COVID-19. And what we found among the majority minority jurisdictions is that these are the most impacted counties within their states. Almost 100% of them have higher death rates than the national death rate. Some are 2 times, 3 times, 6 times, and in one case, 10 times the death rate of the national rate. And for the vast majority of them are greater than the state rate as well. What is also alarming is that these jurisdictions have underdeveloped local emergency management agencies and planning guidelines for all hazards. Often the emergency manager is a secondary role for the fire chief or police chief with little to no additional staff support. So these counties and cities and parishes are at comparative disadvantage when it comes to applying for competitive federal grants and state grants. They also are ill-equipped to inform their population of disasters or recovery funding. So, and I'll give you an example. I have a colleague of mine currently working in disaster recovery in Tennessee, and him and his co-workers were talking amongst themselves about the number of jurisdictions that are not applying for the available funding when it comes to recovery. So either these jurisdictions are not prepared to apply for them or are not aware of them. So we looked at, so my core design, we're looking at the emergency management planning guidelines at the local level. So these tend to be mostly hazard mitigation plans and emergency operation plans. And these rarely, if ever, mention race beyond descriptive statistics of the county that they get from the census data. So it continues to be, we can say the race continues to be a nervous area of local emergency management planning. It's not a core tenet. It operates at a low end and is barely mentioned at all. In fact, in one instance of a county that has actually a high minority population and a high COVID death rate, the only mention of race in the emergency management planning guidelines was the need to prepare for Black Lives Matter riots. Okay, so this is what we're currently operating in. There have been some progress when it comes to other areas of social equity, in particular access and functional needs. But when it comes to race, it cannot be found, okay? And this is true for majority minority communities as well. So I would say, given the projection in the rise of extreme weather events, the continued disproportionate impact of disasters on minority communities, the prevalence of legacy pollutants in these communities, and now the facade of local emergency planning among these communities, this must be considered a form of structural violence. And it must be remedied as we move forward into the future where we expect climate change and disasters to only increase. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very, very thought-provoking and insightful. Your work highlights the importance of the local level and the funding streams, and definitely I know we'll want to revisit that. Let me turn now to Dr. Smith-Mason. I know the focus of this chapter is on educational disparities, and we know that educational disparities existed long before the pandemic. Of course, the problem now is they're even becoming more pronounced as time continues to wane on. So how are educational institutions accounting for these disparities and attempting to regain so much of this lost ground?
Thank you for the question. So in our chapter, we're going to describe higher education's response and policies and procedures. So one of the things that we know and that we've seen, we already knew a digital divide existed. The pandemic has made that even more pronounced. So one of the things that institutions have done, for example, is to provide students with hotspots when they're off campus to have internet access. Certainly one of the challenges has also been, has not just been our students who have not had access to broadband, but even our faculty don't necessarily have that. And some have gone to libraries, gone to the McDonald's to gain access to the internet. And so that's one of the challenges for us. I think another issue that we've seen and where institutions are responding is in terms of mental health. Quite often our students and our faculty, when we are not on campus, lose that support network that they have. And so our institutions have been focusing on providing more opportunities for engagement, in particular for our students, to keep them engaged and connected and having the support that they need as well. And I think also as we look at our staff who are often concentrated perhaps in lower pay bands, what we're asking our institutions to focus on in particular is looking at a social equity lens in every aspect of decision-making that they are doing when it comes to this pandemic to alleviate or address and take into consideration the disparities that our faculty, staff, and students are facing.
Thank you so much. I'd like to, I know this session, we only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to invite Governor Wilder into the conversation to see if he has any comments or thoughts for this panel.
What they are saying and what they are doing, but it raises important questions in my mind. And I guess being an old politician, what I've heard is that, and Keno, you're right, you've got the resources here to educate and tell people. And I thought it was great when we heard from Hans, who spoke of what I call form of structural violence. That hit me. And then when you hear that there's this digital divide, as was spoken to by Dr. Mason, it's one thing to say these things happened in 1968. It's another thing to say that they've not been followed through with. But we're talking about 50 plus years later, and these people who are in charge, making the decisions, many of them are minority. And are you telling me that they are allowing this to continue? I'd like to hear.
That might be
From anyone who chooses.
Dr. Hans Louis Charles, I know you have focused on this. Would you like to respond to the governor's question?
Well, I will try to respond as diplomatically as I can.
No, I don't want you to be diplomatic. I want you to tell it like it is.
Well, they are competing interests, I would say, at the local level. There's limited resources. There's also, when it comes to emergency management, there's an old boys club that minorities are not really that involved in. And there are some initiatives and programs that are trying to address that. But for the most part, yes, it's more or less has been the same. And
did you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, go ahead.
Don't we have minority representatives? Forget the old boys club.
Yeah.
This is the new club.
Yeah, you know, that's, I think that is something.
Let me clarify what I'm saying. I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes.
Right.
But I want to call it like it is.
Well,
and that's what we do at the school.
Yeah.
Now, are you telling me that those persons who say they represent minority interest are not doing it to the extent that you feel? Yes or no?
I mean, you're absolutely right. If I could give you an example, just an anecdotal example from here in Virginia, which I think are among the states that are actually attempting to do something about it, there are still blind spots all over. And so, for example, Manassas, Virginia, according to the US Census, 40% of Manassas population speaks a language other than English within their household. However, if you go to their emergency management policies and guidelines, none of them are available in any language other than English. So I am not sure who emergency management as a field is serving, but it is not the general public. And things have to change drastically. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see what we have been seeing time and time again after every disaster. So I am with you 100%. There are a lot of people that need to answer questions, a lot of people that need to be removed from their positions, restructuring of what the purpose of emergency management is. And we have to evolve into the 21st century quickly.
Very good.
Thank you so much. Great question, of course, from Governor Wilder, and in challenging us to really get down to the nitty-gritty on these topics, which is what we need to do. At this point, my timekeepers are telling us that this session I need to bring this to a close. But of course, the themes we will continue to revisit throughout the other two panels. So I'd like to thank all the panelists that got the conversation started here for the health focus. Now I'd like to turn to our second topical area, which is justice. Lots of key areas here as well. And again, you will see a listing of all the chapters and the contributing authors to this section of the volume as well. And so at this point, I'd like to invite Dr. Jay Albanese, who is a professor in our criminal justice program, to join us in moderating this next session.
Susan, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and part of the Wilder School Symposium. I think these topics are among the most important that are facing in America today. This section will talk very briefly about three of the chapters we're working on for the book volume. The first one, we're going to feature Dr. Cherno Worry, a professor here at Virginia Commonwealth University in the Wilder School, on policing issues, especially trying to find a way out of what seems to be an endless cycle of scandal and reform in local policing especially. He'll be followed by Dr. Christina Mancini, also a professor here at the Wilder School, who will be discussing the implications of COVID and post-COVID for the reentry of justice-involved people. And then our third presenter will be Dr. Stephen Keener. Dr. Keener is an alumnus of the VCU Wilder School PhD program. He's currently a professor at Christopher Newport University. And I should note, he is also founding director of the Center for Crime, Equity, and Justice Research and Policy at Christopher Newport University. So I'm very pleased to have such a qualified group of folks here with me. And if I could begin, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Cherno Worry to talk a little bit about what he sees as a policing expert. He has a background in law enforcement. He's a PhD. He's written on policing. He's clearly a high-level expert on what he sees to be the fundamental issues of scandal and reform and how they might be overcome. Dr. Worry.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. As my colleagues noted early on, the triple pandemic has seen an overlapping contemporary crisis in our justice system, in our economy, and also in our public health and well-being. So what the policing reforms are trying to present in this chapter is basically a threefold section. So we want to highlight the historical aspect first, and then the current practices in policing. And then the second section we want to highlight in this chapter is just recognizing and changing the legal landscape of policing. And then the last section we want to cover is just basically give up some recommendations on how we can dig ourselves out of this unfulfilled police reform, just this cycle of police reforms that are not being fulfilled. So the first section, circling back, is just talking about the historical aspects. So we highlight people like Sir Robert Peel and his work with the London Metropolitan Police Act in 1829. And then fast forward to the early 1700s towards the early 1800s. Here in Virginia, we highlight things like slave patrols, how much slave patrol resembled some of the current policing practices that we see. And so we explore that a lot in this first section. And then also we want to cover the eras of policing, wherein we have the political era, the reform era, and then also the community era. And we highlight the reform era for the most because we have folks like O.W. Wilson and August Vollmer, who worked on the Wickersham Commission that was presented in the 1930s. And according to that commission report, several police scandals and police corruption and misconduct was actually revealed to us. And so several reforms were unveiled too, or we proposed after that. And then all the way to today, We compare current practices of policing, training and treatments, and so forth. And then jumping into the second section, we want to cover the legalistic landscape of policing. Within the past 50 years, several Supreme Court cases have given police the discretion that they have to work or to carry on their duties. And some of those cases that we highlight, or we will be highlighting, Terry versus Ohio, which talked about stop and frisk, and also Matt versus Ohio, we talked about searches and seizure. And then also Tennessee versus Garner, we talked about the use of force standard. And lastly, it's the Graham versus Connor case, which I think was one of the most complicated cases that talked about the objectively reasonable standard, wherein deals with if officers are making, or when officers are conducting investigative stops and also using force to effect an arrest, a reasonable person from the outside can watch and say the officer is actually being objectively reasonable while they're carrying on their duties. And then the third section is basically how we will get ourselves out of this cycle of unfulfilled police reforms. So we're proposing several things, and of those things, the ones we're listing or highlighting on here, and I'll just give three, is just basically exploring and examining the organizational culture of policing within and outside of policing. And then also we're looking at recruitment and training. Are these training streamlined among police departments, or are they just piecemeal, or are they just on a jurisdictional basis? And then lastly also is to propose things that are legal, wherein we focus more on the probable cause rather than just mere hunches or suspicions. Suspicions are what have gotten us to where we are today. Some of these mere suspicions have led to detrimental and negative interactions between law enforcement and especially our minority communities. So we want to propose things that are more tangible for some of these things. And so I look forward to discussing this and addressing any more topics or questions we have. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Worry. We will be coming back to you with questions, but in the interest of time, let me jump to Dr. Christina Mancini to talk about the issue of justice-involved persons and what was going on during the pandemic and how are we going to improve on that. Dr. Mancini.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, the term justice-involved person is a little clunky, but there's an intentional usage there. It reflects this larger trend in society, I think, and also in the field of criminal justice to use people first language. So this is a big deal in our discipline because so many people, we hear about the revolving door, right? People who start, have a stay of incarceration, and the thought is they continue to go back and forth into prison. That is a concern, but over 85% of all people who serve time in prison will be released into the general population. This means we cannot prison our way out of the crime problem. And so it's incumbent on all of us to treat the root causes. Now, how does this link up to race and the pandemic? Well, reentry is a problem for all of us, but in the minority community, it's particularly amplified. And this is because of disproportionate minority contact as well as confinement. So the idea is if a population makes up a certain percentage in the general world, we should see if there's no bias or disparity, similar rates of that population in our correctional system. In most states, we don't see that. Here in Virginia, African Americans make up about 19–20% of the general population. But in our prison population, they make up over 50%. And in some states, that's even more pronounced. In some states do a better job and it's not as disproportionate. But we obviously have been concerned about this issue for a very long time. But this is related to reentry because we know if 85% of people released from society come back into the free population, the concern is with reentry, the challenge is magnified for the minority community. Think about how difficult it is in just this general climate to find employment, stable housing, right? For some folks who come out of prison, there are restrictions on where they can live. They can't go back to their families. They might not be able to enter certain fields because of that stigma, that scarlet letter, if you will, of having a prior conviction. And so the question becomes, this is not, again, something we can prison our way out of. These folks come back into society, and whether you're concerned about their well-being and the well-being of their communities and their families, or you're a law and order person who isn't so concerned about individuals, we should all be concerned about reentry because folks who are better transition back into the community are less likely to recidivate. They're less likely to go back into prison. They're more likely to contribute to society. And so reentry is really an issue we should all care about. And that's what the chapter explores. Now enter the pandemic, right? So you can already get a feel that reentry is difficult on a normal day, but enter COVID-19, which we've heard from some of the other panelists, has had tremendous impacts on communities in terms of health outcomes, housing disparities, and the like. And so you can see how that can be magnified among this, I call it a super marginalized population. The re-entering population has so many strikes against them from the get-go. And so unless we're going to do more, social equity licenses are one example of something that, again, we have a lot of blind spots, as our prior contributors talked about, but I'm really excited about those social equity licenses. Now, I know there's a lot up in the air of what they actually mean, but this is the first time having a criminal conviction can actually propel someone into a position, right? Rather than being a strike against them. So I'm really fingers crossed that these work out the way I think that they're well-intentioned. We'll see. But that's one example of something we're doing here in Virginia that might work to restore that population. And of course, there's a lot more we need to do.
Dr. Mancini, thank you very much. Very, very interesting content there, and time permitting, we'll be back to you. I want to get to our third presenter, Dr. Stephen Keener, who's going to give us the background on the public protests and demonstrations that occurred during the pandemic, and what was behind it all, and what have we learned, if anything. Dr. Keener.
Thank you, Dr. Albanese. So for our chapter, we're going to do a couple things. One, we're going to give an overview of the protests that happened during the pandemic, but particularly peaked during last summer. And what we're going to talk about in the chapter is we're showing that this, things have been building up to this for a while, particularly the proliferation of cell phone videos, or particularly the past decade, capturing police use of force, sometimes lethal force, but it predominantly against people of color and predominantly young Black men. And so we're going to walk through those and show how, protests in response to the deaths of individuals like Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, among others, kind of laid the foundation for the protests of last summer. We're also going to talk about, prior to the protest, the conversation around, when you start seeing these protests and you see this disproportionate rate of people of color being killed by police, one of the first questions is, where's the data, right? How much is it? How often is this happening? And the data really wasn't there. The data that was there wasn't good. And so we're going to talk about the Washington Post and the Guardian in particular, and their efforts to build a database and try to give us a more accurate description or more accurate look at how often this was happening. Then we're going to transition into the catalyst event for last summer, which was the murder of George Floyd by former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. And what we're going to show there is how that catalyst event that was caught on cell phone footage not only spread on social media, it was on national news, it became an international news story. And you see these protests that start in Minneapolis spread across the world, and to the point where it's the largest social and racial justice protest we've seen since the civil rights era. And so during that time, and many of these protests persisted long into the summer, if not longer than that. During that same time frame, you hear about the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, which is further going to accelerate these protests. And we're also in there going to talk about, which has been better documented recently, some of the antagonistic behavior of police officers during the protest, and how that helped fuel them and often helped lead to the persistence of the protest. And so after giving an overview of the protest, we're going to shift focus to what were the outcomes? What were the implications of that? And we're going to look at things ranging from public perceptions of the Black Lives Matter movement. We're also going to look at calls for reimagining public safety, rethinking funding streams toward police departments, mental health services, and other social services. And then we'll also look at how this incident in particular and the larger protests not only led to calls for reforming the criminal justice system, which has a long, well-documented history of racial discrimination, but it called for larger looks at systemic discrimination and structural issues across social institutions beyond just the criminal justice system. And so that's where we'll wrap up the chapter and kind of look forward, like where do we see this going forward in terms of the role of public protests going forward, but also what has been accomplished in terms of reform since then, but what's still left to do.
Excellent. So thank you very much. And if I could quickly jump back to Cherno Worry, and if I can get, I'm going to ask you each a question. If you give me a quick take in about a minute, which I know college professors don't do very well, but who does, right? Dr. Worry, I mean, just in the past 2 weeks, we've had good news and bad news. Bad news. After the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and all the others in the past year, there was a big move within Congress to advance police reform. Anyway, last week, that reform effort was abandoned. Republicans and Democrats could not agree on things such as chokeholds and no-knock warrants and so on, things that were at the core of the debate. That's the bad news. Good news, on the other hand, at least partially good news, the Department of Justice itself announced guidelines that, of course, would only affect federal agencies that would explicitly prohibit chokeholds, carotid restraints, and severely limit the circumstances when law enforcement can use no-knock entries. Now, of course, that is from the Department of Justice. So their only police agencies in there are the FBI and DEA and ATF and a few others. But so my question to you is, how do you make of this? We seem to be getting jerked around. On one half, there seems to be efforts for some level of reform of policing, but then on the other hand, efforts don't seem to succeed. What do you make of all that?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Great question. And again, I'm just going to be as real as the governor said. You know, as a Black man first and a former police officer for almost a decade, I've seen changes in policing. Even though folks, they see it as it's moving in the snail's pace, things are happening, things are changing. Things that I would have gotten in trouble for as a police officer back then, would not have gotten into trouble for back then. Now I would get in trouble for if I was a police officer. I'm seeing things are happening. So yes, we have to keep pushing for more streamlined community boards and amongst police departments from federal, state, and local to be all on the same page when we talk about police reforms. It does not work when you have federal standards, state standards, and then local standards. It has to be all one stream standard for local, state, and federal. So some of the things I'm seeing individualized departments are doing are like they're proposing the no-knock warrants with the Breonna's law. And we see things like they're reclassifying calls for service wherein police officers are not being sent to calls now that have higher risk of negative interactions, like dealing with the homeless population or dealing with suspicious person or someone with some kind of emotionally disturbed issue. So they would send specific folks to respond to that. And we see things like civilian review boards that are going across the nation too. And we see various things out there. We see the Community Policing Act too, which is making its way around the country about officers stopping and giving demographics and reason for the stop and what was the outcome of the stop. So yes, as a former police officer, I know we hated change back in the days, but now we are seeing a lot of things happening and things are going to continue to happen and things are going to change as we move forward in this police reform era. So things will happen. They may be taking us slow, not too fast, but things will happen and things will change.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. To Dr. Mancini, quickly to you. Rearrest rates remain stubbornly high. The Bureau of Justice Statistics just released a new report, and they followed up everybody who's been released in 2005, followed them for 5 years, and 77% were rearrested within 5 years, right? Given America's reliance on incarceration as a solution to crime, it doesn't seem to be working well. Then they did it for people who'd been released in 2012, followed up. The good news is the rearrest rate dropped from 77% to 71%. The bad news is it's still a miserable rearrest rate. Now, I know you addressed some of this in your comments, but the question is, if we continue to rely on incarceration as a way to punish people, why is it so ineffective in doing what apparently was originally the intent? What's your thoughts on that?
I think it puts a Band-Aid on a gusher, so to speak. It's not addressing the root issue of why people have a higher propensity to engage in crime. So we're not dealing with mental health issues, which I've heard that come up a lot. And we deinstitutionalized a lot of our mental health care in the 70s and 80s, and I think we're reaping that. And I guess one thing I want to turn away from is the thought that, well, maybe the public is, right? The governor likes to say, we the people, by the people, right? Maybe the public wants this, right? They want to lock people up. And so legislators are just lockstep and with the public. I would say the data show that's not true. The public is actually quite receptive to other efforts, not just Get Tough. We've seen Steve's talk about just the idea that people are starting to recognize injustice. It's been there a long time, but starting to wake up and realize, wow, this happens much more frequently than I thought it did. And so this has kind of scurried down into many populations. And so the public is actually not supportive of these efforts to just lock them up. And that's it. They're quite receptive to other types of reform. So I think it's dealing with those structural issues that you mentioned that we don't want to. It seems like incarceration is easier to deal with, but it's fixing those root causes. And the public wants more. They don't just want lock them up. So maybe that will be a first step into changing some of this ineffective solutions.
All right. So thank you very much. Of course, I have questions for Stephen, but I wanted to make sure if the governor has any comments, Governor Wilder, we'd certainly love to hear them.
Well, thank you. Jay, it's always good to be with you, and your panel has been very good, and they've had excellent observations. One of the things I wanted to point out, and I thought I'd said it if I hadn't, that the most important form of government is local government, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the people are. And yet when you hear those who are representing them at the local levels, they pass off things that they expect the public to buy wholesale and not go into the retail analysis of it. For instance, all right, now we have restored your rights. What rights have been restored? Only the right to vote? I don't know any right that has been restored. You try to get a job with a record. So that hasn't changed, and it hasn't changed in a long time. In local elections and uniform training is very important. And as a state senator, I put in the law to require uniform training for police officers. That you couldn't, if you wanted state money in your constitutional affairs. And so can it be done? Yes. You don't have to go to Washington to wait for Washington to determine how you're going to handle your police force. You do that at the local level. And more importantly, there are instances which the chief of police, the prosecutors, the judges, they're all people of color. Look, in this last so-called demonstration here, you had the people who were marching with the protesters were elected officials. And so my question is, where do you put the responsibility on those people to do what is right and not to believe that we've got to wait for some edict that comes from Washington?
Very good point. You are, of course, correct. As you know, the vast majority of police in the US are local police, city, town, village, county level police, the overwhelming majority. And most of the incidents that we talk about of the last year and the last 50 years for that matter, are things that occur at the local level. And of course, the issue, as you point out, there's 700 local police academies around the country, supervised to a greater or usually a lesser extent by state law. Usually they're handled regionally or locally, so there's not uniformity. And then the Supreme Court won't leave well enough alone. The law keeps changing all the time. So in trying to keep up with what is appropriate and what is not, it's very, very difficult. But the point you make is a good one. Most lasting change comes from the bottom up rather than from the top down, and perhaps some more responsibility at the local level is where we should be looking for lasting change. Any other comments from the panel as we wrap up?
I'll add to that, Governor, real quick. I think with my students here at Christopher Newport, we talk a lot about the role of prosecutors in all this, right? And the fact that prosecutors are elected, but most of them run unopposed. Nearly all of them win re-election, and most of them have built political careers off of the tough on crime mantra, the tough on crime ideas. And so a lot of, in our classes, students always ask, well, what do I do? And one of the easiest things is get involved locally, pay attention to your state elections. And I do worry, and we have these conversations down here, we're becoming very nationalized. Our focus is very nationalized. especially when it comes to news. And you're right, so much of what's going on at the local level, especially in criminal justice, is dictated by those local officials and local policies. And so, yeah, as a professor, that's always trying to motivate young people to pay attention to those elections, pay attention to what's going on in your city councils, pay attention to what's going on in your mayoral offices, because that is where some of the most direct and often long-term impact happens.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have to wrap. Thank you to a very good panel, and let me turn it back over to Dr. Gooden. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Albanese, and to the panel. Again, very salient points that were made. We now turn our attention to the final area of the book, which is the economic impact. A lot of ground to cover there. And again, you'll see the listing of all the chapters and the contributing authors for this section before you on the screen. It's my pleasure to welcome the moderator of this session, who is an associate professor in the Wilder School and director of our PhD program, Dr. Elsie Harper Anderson. Dr. Harper Anderson.
Thank you, Dean Gooden. Thank you, Dean Gooden, and thank you all for joining us for this final session of the event. It's an honor to be part of the Wilder Symposium. So far, we've had a rich discussion about health and wellness, as well as justice. Now we turn to the economy. We have three presenters. I am Elsie Harper Anderson, Associate Professor of Urban and Regional Planning and Director of the Wilder School Doctoral Program. We also have, and I'll be presenting on the impact of COVID-19 on Black workers and businesses. We also have Dr. Ben Teresa, who is an Assistant Professor in Urban and Regional Studies and Planning, and also co-director of the RVA Evictions Lab. His presentation will be focused on evictions and housing instability. And finally, we will have Dr. Grant Rissler, who is an affiliate faculty member at the Wilder School and has previously held positions within our Center for Public Policy. His presentation will focus on immigration and equity issues. Okay, so first I'll begin with my presentation. So our chapter, as I said, focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on African-American workers and businesses in Virginia. Like many other places, Virginia was hit hard economically by the pandemic. Black businesses and workers were hit particularly hard. Blacks have been in a precarious economic position since their arrival in the US due to the system enshrined with racist policies and conventions that have resulted in persistent systematic and institutional inequality, which has meant that Blacks were already in a vulnerable economic position in 2020 before the pandemic hit. Unemployment in Virginia is lower than in the US. However, the Black-white gap in terms of unemployment is wider in Virginia, and it persisted throughout the pandemic and in fact increased. While Black workers only make up 19% of the labor force in Virginia, they made up a disproportionate share of the initial unemployment claims. For most of the weeks between January and September, that percentage was over 35%, and it reached as high as 48% in July. All of this while our unemployment system in Virginia was ranked amongst the lowest and constantly in the news. Blacks were also overrepresented in frontline industries in Virginia as they were in the rest of the country. However, the overrepresentation of African Americans in frontline occupations was greater in Virginia. For example, while in the US, African Americans make up 33% of home health aides, in Virginia, they made up 50%. Blacks were also less likely to be able to work remotely in Virginia, and they were more likely to miss work due to COVID. So all of those implications for all of those patterns in the labor market have tremendous implication for economic well-being. We also looked at businesses. It's important to note that it is highly unlikely that we will ever know the true impact of COVID-19 on Black-owned businesses, because as a previous panelist pointed out, the data doesn't exist, especially as it relates to race. However, I will note a couple of things about businesses. At the beginning of the pandemic, between February and April, the number of Blacks who identified as business owners decreased by 41% nationwide. In Virginia, the same trend occurred, where the number of Blacks who identified as self-employed decreased by 24%. I also want to point out that the policy response created greater inequality. For example, with the PPP loans, I'll just hit a few highlights. We know that communities with a greater share of Black residents received fewer loans, and the loans overall were for smaller amounts on average. Also, we know that Black-owned businesses had a harder time getting those loans. The implications of the impacts of the coronavirus on Black workers and businesses are far-reaching. Virginia has begun to initiate numerous initiatives, including workforce development, economic development, housing, and others. It will be critical going forward that those initiatives that are designed to address the implications of the pandemic, that the programming and policies are race-specific and directly impact the system of racial inequality upon which the pandemic issues were layered over. So race-specific policies in wealth building, in economic development, and community development are going to be critical. Thank you very much. So next we will have Dr. Ben Teresa give his presentation on eviction.
Thank you so much. So in our chapter, what we aim to do is to evaluate and understand how in Richmond's eviction diversion program, how participants in that program were fared. This is a diversion program that takes those tenants who have a lawsuit filed against them for typically non-payment of rent, and intervenes in the court process so that they can come with an alternative to eviction. And this is, so one of the things that we were able to do, this is a program that's in partnership with the Central Virginia Legal Aid Society, as well as Housing Opportunities Made Equal with funding from the city of Richmond. And so there were over 600 program participants in this, in the eviction diversion program that began in 2019. We were able to contact through surveys and interviews about 70 of these participants. And in the course of that, we learned several things about the eviction diversion program. First of all, most of these participants are represented, are in fact Black women and heads of households, the majority of which have children. And so this program is especially targeted to that specific need that's highly racialized when we talk about housing instability. And almost all of the participants in the eviction diversion program were able to stay in their homes. At the same time, what we learned about participants' experiences is that while they are able to stay in their homes, many of the underlying causes of housing instability that would include things like unaffordable rent, people paying 30% or 50% or more of their income towards rent, poor job quality, childcare costs, and transportation, that all these factors effectively remain in place, even though kind of the immediate need of housing stability, of keeping people in their homes, was successful for most participants, almost all participants. And also, the eviction diversion program wasn't initially designed as a COVID emergency program. It was designed prior to COVID. And in the COVID period, the program changed. And so rental assistance, assistance from local and then later state funds really became a very important part of the process. And so being able to pay rent debt and make emergency rental assistance payments as part of this process was a really important part of the program. And so how we conclude the chapter is by thinking about how the eviction diversion program might help us think about COVID policy and also post-COVID eviction policy. And so one of a few key insights, which I can talk more about perhaps in the discussion, though, is that first of all, most obviously, an eviction diversion program helps tenants avoid eviction courts, which typically, in almost all cases, when a tenant goes to court, they ultimately end up losing their housing. It also increases legal aid, attorney, and tenant contact. And this helps us in a couple of ways, helps certainly the tenant to know their rights and navigate the system, but also helps us understand what are the underlying causes of housing instability, which can help us lead to reforms. And there are a number of important reforms that came out of the eviction diversion program being used quite heavily in Richmond public housing. And so there's a number of critical reforms that have since been implemented as a result of the program. And finally, we think that it helps us increase local and state capacity to address housing instability both in the pandemic and after. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Teresa. Next, we will have Dr. Grant Rissler discuss the implications for immigration and immigrants.
Thank you, Dr. Harper Anderson, and to everybody for attending today. Immigrants, of course, have long been recognized as a vulnerable group within society, and in many ways, the pandemic worsened those disparities. In Virginia, at one point in the pandemic, more than 49% of all COVID cases came from the Latino or Latinx community, which would have a significant proportion who are immigrant. And the Latinx community only makes up about 10% of Virginia's population. In the context of pandemic shutdowns, the Migration Policy Institute found that foreign-born workers make up 19% of US workers in frontline industries, and unemployment rates among immigrants hit 15% compared to about a little bit more than 12% for US-born workers. So immigrants disproportionately can't stay home, can't miss work to get vaccines, don't have insurance perhaps to cover costs of a visit to the doctor or a hospital. So some of this disparity tragically was predictable. We talk a lot about the systemic issues. Just to take one example, think about language barriers. In an evolving crisis situation, clear communication and sharing of accurate information is critical. Yet many state and local governments are still playing catch up to the demographic shifts of the past 30 years. The Virginia of 1990 had a foreign-born population of about 300,000 persons. 30 years later, when the pandemic hit, that number had tripled to over 1 million, fully 12.7% of the population. And immigrants are increasingly spread across the Commonwealth and the United States to what we call new immigrant destinations, not just outside DC, but Harrisonburg in the Eastern Shore. 20 years of research explores how state and local governments have responded to this influx of immigration-driven diversity. And this is where we see the systemic coming in. Some are inclusionary, ensuring key materials in a variety of languages. Others are exclusionary, English-only mandates for local government offices. But most are laissez-faire. They don't take any specific action to this change in diversity, at least at the level of elected officials and top administrators. And that's where, as Dr. Louis Charles noted, many localities were systematically and systemically unprepared to communicate with immigrants in an emergency like this. Alongside this systemic perspective is also this one, and I think it's a hopeful one. At the street level, researchers have often found public administrators coming up with ways to meet the needs of immigrant residents, even if top administrators aren't paying attention. What's the takeaway of all of this for social equity? While systemic responses have to occur at the level of those top administrators and elected officials, the opportunity for innovation is often happening at the street level, closest to the people, as Governor Wilder pointed out. The chapter uses this understanding from research to look then at news reports in Virginia and build several case studies that point to opportunities for increasing immigrant social equity in Virginia as we emerge from this crisis. Opportunities like more standardized access to language materials in a variety of languages and cultural awareness among workers on the front lines. Also, cooperation across departments and localities is a possibility. And partnerships between those localities and agencies. So that's where the chapter takes us. And I think the takeaway is that there is a lot of work to do, but also the ability to shift the curve that we've been seeing with intentionality.
Grant, thank you so much for that very insightful presentation. I have a question that I would like to pose to both Dr. Teresa and Dr. Rissler. How can we leverage the support programs put forth during the pandemic to address, how can we leverage some of that support to address some of the structural issues that you pointed to, particularly some of the support that came down from the federal government to the state and has now been pushed out to the local level. Dr. Rissler, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I think one of the key focuses needs to be kind of previewing the possibility of disparate impact based on knowledge of the immigrant population. One of the key themes throughout new immigrant destination research is that sometimes immigrants just aren't visible to local governments and to state governments because the governments aren't set up to see them, to hear them. And previewing that is important. Even with the expanded child tax credit that was a key feature of the Biden administration, there's an example of what can unintentionally happen. About 1 in 5 children in poverty have at least one parent who is not a documented immigrant or an unauthorized immigrant. And so there's close to 2 million children that can't access fully those funds coming down under existing law. So we have to see how those intersect and then build ways to find solutions in real time. And I think the opportunity there is that with some of the funding that has been devolved to states and local governments to invest in some of this cultural awareness and linguistic access infrastructure that is very important.
Thank you. Dr. Teresa?
Thank you. So I think that what becomes clear is when you look at the Virginia case for delivering rental assistance. So this is a little beyond the scope of the chapter and just focused on the diversion program. But of course, Congress allocated almost $50 billion to the states for emergency rental assistance in COVID. Virginia is currently number 1 or number 2 in terms of dispersing those funds to tenants and landlords. And so we should be proud of that and understand what it takes to be able to set up a program like that. So Virginia did not have an emergency rental assistance program established at the state level prior to the COVID pandemic. It moved early on. The Department of Housing and Community Development as well as VHDA moved early on in the pandemic, actually using state funds before federal funds were allocated to build the institutional capacity to be able to quickly deliver rental assistance to tenants and landlords. But I think, you know, the performance has been mediocre to downright abysmal across the country and other states. And so I think it shows the need to think quite seriously about building state capacity, particularly for providing and supporting affordable housing. So that would not just be for emergency situations, but for expanding the production of affordable housing, as well as preservation of affordable housing, and then you know, ensuring kind of a safety net in housing as well.
Thank you. So I would like to ask Governor Wilder if he had something that he wanted to add to this discussion on the impact on the economy.
Well, thank you, Doctor. I want to congratulate the panelists on what I think has been fantastic in terms of putting the issues out there as to where they are. Dr. Anderson, you and I have discussed this issue ourselves directly before, and we've known the shortcomings and we've spoken to them. I do like what Ben has said, I'm sorry, the doctor said relative to the performance level that we have. I recall as a senator putting forth the legislation relative to setting up what we call now the uniform housing laws in Virginia and uniform lease laws, the kinds of things that fixed it so the localities wouldn't be varying from one to the other as to what we do. It's very important, as I think all have said, that the public be made aware, that the public be involved, and that they do know that they can get the kind of help and the uniformity of a lease, the uniformity of conversions from condominiums, from apartments to the condominiums. Those are the kinds of things, and fairness and equity for all concerned. And I congratulate all of you for having addressed those issues.
Thank you, Governor. I'm going to turn things back over to Dean Gooden. Thank you all for your attention to this panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harper Anderson, and to the panelists. As we look to conclude this session, there's been such rich information shared. You know, Governor, I think if I had to summarize this, my summary would be one of your phrases, which is to follow the money. We're hearing a lot about money, a lot of money that has been allocated, but it's not really clear the impact of that money and how that relates to race. Your thoughts on that, Governor?
Dean, you got it. You got it exactly. Follow the money. My one-word definition still holds true, that you can't name a single thing that has been discussed, that will be discussed, that doesn't involve money. And so it's one thing to say that you're spending money on an issue, but the other thing is to say, how are you spending that money? And I think it's very important for those of us who pay the money and pay the taxes for those monies to be spent to have some say-so in it. And I think the more information, again, congratulations to you for setting forth the symposium, and also for the institution of RISE, the Research Institute for Social Equity. This is all we've been talking about this morning. And yet, I don't know that this goes on at all of the universities. I don't know that it goes on in the city halls. I don't know that it goes on in the town halls. And I know that a lot of it is not going on in Washington as it should be. So I thank you for the opportunity to participate. And again, I encourage you to thank all of the panelists. They have done an excellent job. And as I said earlier, they are experts and they are saying what the people want to hear. More of the people need to become involved. And as it relates to those decisions being made, many of the people who make those decisions couldn't be there to make those decisions unless we put them there. We need to remind them of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Governor. Always great to have your words of wisdom and your insight. And your legacy of leadership, of course, is unparalleled nationally and internationally. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for this outstanding session and symposium. A special thanks to Governor Wilder for inviting us to have this as a subject matter for this symposium, our forthcoming book on the triple pandemic. As we wrap up, if you'd like to hear more from Governor Wilder, he has a 12-part podcast series, Conversations with Governor Wilder, which can be found on SoundCloud and by scanning the QR code you see on your screen. Lots of great topics there, financial management, leadership. I encourage you strongly to listen to those podcasts and to share those as well. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to recruit. Are you or someone you know thinking about graduate school? Please consider the Wilder School. We are always interested in attracting the next generation of leaders to our school. We are having a session on October 22nd where you can learn more about our Wilder School graduate programs and certificates, and we invite you to please share that information with people in your networks. And also, in terms of, there's a lot going on in the Wilder School, and we encourage you to follow us on our social media channels. Today's symposium will be on our YouTube channel, where you can find other Wilder School programming as well. And of course, you can always find us on Facebook and Twitter. And finally, but most importantly, I'd like to recognize and thank our Wilder School communications team. They have done just an outstanding job in handling all of the logistics for today's event. And we all know how time-consuming but important that can be. So thank you again for joining us today at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs as we discussed our forthcoming edited volume, The Triple Pandemic. And we look forward to sharing additional information with you about the volume's publication in a few months. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great afternoon.